Hello, this is Daniel King with my play of the day from round 2 of the Wijk aan Zee tournament. All 7 games were drawn today, however there was some fantastic fighting chess, and the game I've chosen as my play of the day is that between Levon Aronian and Magnus Carlsen. If you recall, Aronian Carlsen played just a month ago in the London Chess Classic, and Carlsen won a very nice game indeed. So could Aronian fight back? Let's have a look. So Aronian had the white pieces this time. In London he had black, and he started with d4, and the game went into a King's Indian. Now that's a bit of a surprise. It's pretty rare that Carlsen plays the King's Indian, but this is rather typical of Carlsen's tactics in the opening. He likes to surprise his opponent with his choice of variation, and well, playing the King's Indian is certainly a sign that he's up for a fight, an unbalanced struggle. And Aronian repeated the line that he'd actually played in round 1 of this tournament against Van Velde, this line with h3. Now this is a very sharp line indeed. In many variations, White tries to get in g4 to cramp Black's traditional kingside play. Sometimes it's just a way of playing bishop e3 without allowing knight g4. In any case, it's a very sharp variation. So Aronian is up for a fight as well. And e5 was the move that Van Velde played yesterday, and we got a very traditional King's Indian pawn structure. But today Carlsen had prepared this, well, rather unusual move, knight c6. Of course, it's a very provocative move from Carlsen, and very typical for him actually. You know, he's provoking this move d5, which Aronian duly played, so the knight has to move again. Of course, it means this diagonal is now opened for the bishop. But it's pretty curious to send this knight out here as well. Of course, you know, White can drive this knight away very, very easily with a3. But okay, Carlsen likes to just play interesting, unusual positions. That's his aim in the opening, just to try and unsettle his opponent. But, well, Aronian wasn't too unsettled. He just developed very calmly with bishop e2, and now e6 from Carlsen. So, you know, he hasn't played the traditional King's Indian move e5. Instead, you know, he's looking to try to get some pressure on the e-file. So, okay, bishop e3, all very nice development from Aronian. Now, the reason he didn't castle was because he wanted to play this move, bishop e3, and knight d2. So that means he's managed to protect e4, and that means that in this position he can recapture with the c-pawn. So now you can see both knights defend e4, and well, that's a very healthy pawn structure for White with this nice central pawn majority. So that's the reason he played bishop e3, to get the bishop out so it's not blocked in by the knight on d2. Okay, a5 from Carlsen. Well, at some point White would like to play a3 and b4, so a5 preempts this strike, so the knight can drop back to a6 and b4 would be covered. Okay, castles, and now bishop d7. Okay, so Aronian is just playing very steadily here, rook e1, and it makes sense to, you know, perhaps give the bishops and the pawns some protection here. b6 from Carlsen. Okay, this is all very steady, and rook c1, very steady from Aronian. Well, it's clear to me that, you know, these moves like b6, Carlsen actually doesn't have many opportunities to, you know, find a good plan here. And I think that was borne out by his next move, king h8. To me, to my eyes, a very odd move indeed. As we'll see later on, there is some point to this move, but to me it's almost kind of a waiting move actually. I have to say I would prefer the immediate regrouping of this knight to c5. I think this gives black a little bit more freedom. You know, it's not it's not really possible for white to play a3 and b4 straight away, because of course you play a4, controlling b3, just cramping those pawns. So king h8, yeah, this is, well, a little bit mysterious actually, but I think it's really a sign that Carlsen doesn't have many active chances here. Okay, a3 played, the knight retreats, and now queen c2. So Aronian, I like his play actually. He's playing very steadily indeed. And now this is a big moment for Carlsen. He decides to close the position to reach a typical kind of King's Indian structure with these locked pawns in the centre of the board. Well, it wasn't an easy position. You know, he could have played knight c5, but then I think b3, well, I think not b4, because that would allow black to exchange some pieces, but I think if Aronian just played b3 and sat there, it's very, very difficult for black to generate play here, and I think slowly Aronian would creep forward. So I can understand why Carlsen wanted to do something in this position, but still, I think this is a very favourable King's Indian position for white, because black lacks the traditional counterplay on the king's side with f5 and f4, and white is already rolling quite quickly on the queen side with, well, he's going to get in b4 and c5. So I think things have turned out very well for Aronian. Rook b1, here we go. He wants to play b4 and c5, and white already stands well. And if knight c5 here, then after this move, not exchanging, but knight b5 is very strong here, because suddenly the knight is stranded and rook a1 is happening, winning the knight. So Carlsen played knight g8. Okay, obviously he's making room for the f-pawn, but also he might wish to exchange bishops like this. b4, and Carlsen went for it with f5. But somehow white's play is very well developed on the queen side. This knight is looking rather stranded on a6. And now here's an excellent response to f5 from Aronian. He played knight b5. Very tricky indeed. So, okay, it looks as though black can win a piece, trapping the bishop. But now bishop takes b6. This is an excellent piece sacrifice. You know, very sharply calculated by Aronian. So there's even a threat of knight f7 mate. So rook f8 was played. Excuse me, wasn't played. This is only a variation. If rook f8, then c5. And white has tremendous compensation here. I mean, the pawns maybe aren't rolling straight away, but you know, white can build up very, very easily here. This knight is vulnerable on a6. Well, a fantastic compensation for the piece. So I think it's quite understandable that Carlsen didn't go in for that, but played instead bishop h6. Well, I think from a positional point of view, it's probably desirable to exchange off this sort of bad bishop on g7, well, for this excellent bishop on e3. But Aronian comes up with a nice response. Okay, first of all he took, then he exchanged on f5, and well, I don't know, I somehow I prefer knight takes f5 in this position. I think this might give black a few more counter chances in the game. At least, you know, he's going to try to get the knight into d4. But Carlsen played in the traditional King's Indian way, recapturing with the g pawn. So the pawns look very strong. But now an excellent move from Aronian. Well, this stops any nonsense with black advancing with f4, but also puts a lot of pressure here. Now this is a very uncomfortable position for Carlsen, but somehow it's in adversity that Carlsen often shows his best. There are so many ways for black to play, but well, I think there's only one that gives black counter chances actually. So for example, if queen h4, which looks very tempting to try to build an attack on the king side like this, but this is already tremendous for white. Queen c3 I think is a key move, and the queen covers on the king side, but also the threats on the diagonal and the threats to e5 are very unpleasant indeed. So, you know, for example, if knight f7, well, we roll on with the pawns, and this, and now knight c4, and you can see that black's centre is actually collapsing. It's very nasty for black that the king stands in the corner. What else? You could play e4 here, but then queen c3 check, and actually the black king is very uncomfortably placed here. Knight f1 I think is a good move. We're going to send the knight round to h5. There's the possibility later on of swinging the rook up to g3, and, well, look at black's pieces behind those pawns. The centre is too static. So Carlsen, I think, played e takes f4, which I think is his best chance. It looks so ugly, but in fact it's his best chance, because at least in this position he has the chance to create some play on the e file, maybe getting his knight into e5. Well, this is still very good for Aronian. He played well here. If queen e3, then the king comes here, and actually black's king is in some trouble. So queen f8 from Carlsen. He defended very well indeed. So the knight would like to come to e5. So that meant that Aronian had to take. Well, this isn't bad for white, but it has meant that at least Carlsen has managed to simplify the position a little bit. And he does have a little bit of play on the e-file. But, you know, this is an isolated pawn, and white is doing well in this position. Knight d4, nice move, controlling, you know, all these squares. Queen e5 from Carlsen, so he's fighting, you know, he's trying to simplify. Good move from Aronian. Doesn't want to take straight away, of course that would straighten out the pawns and suddenly black will be absolutely fine. So check, queen came back, and knight f3. Okay, so Aronian has managed to bring his knights into the game beautifully, you know, coming into e6, but at least Carlsen has exchanged pieces. After the game, Aronian thought he was doing extremely well here, but it's not quite as simple as it looks. Okay, this is quite a critical moment. So rook f1, it looks as though that the pawn is in trouble. Takes, and now if knight takes b4, then g4 is very good for white indeed. White is going to recover the pawn, and, well, with a tremendous position. So Carlsen played h5, and this is a critical moment, I think. After the game, Aronian said, well, he thought that g4 was practically winning. But he said, oh, my intuition failed me. But it's not so simple. He thought maybe that, after h5, instead of g4, he should take on f5. But it's not so simple. Black manages to exchange lots of pawns here. And the d pawn is hanging, and I think black should make a draw. So this is instead of g4. b5 might be the best chance, and then going for this. I think this is an improved version. So black takes the pawn on the queen side, but the knight holds these pawns, and then the king can try to come up and grab this pawn and maybe support these pawns. It's impossible to say whether this is winning or not, but I think that might be white's best chance. Okay, g4 was played in the game, which, as I said, Aronian thought was winning. But Carlsen's tactics here are to try to exchange as many pawns as possible. Now, it seems as though Aronian is making progress, and this is an absolutely critical position. It's extraordinary how Carlsen somehow manages to find defences here, for example, if black is careless, let's say, I don't know, knight c2, trying to activate the knight, well, now it's possible to advance the pawn. If king h7, we keep going, and g7, and well, you can see the knight is way out of play, and rook f8 is happening. Or king h5, well, this wins the rook. What else is there? If instead rook e7, we can check, and then play very simply rook f6, threatening g6 and g7, and the game is over. Okay, how did Carlsen defend? He played c6. As Aronian said after the game, he thought he was winning, but after c6, it's a kind of miracle that black is surviving. That's what Aronian said, but well, Carlsen manages to pull off a miracle. Let's see the point of c6. Okay, king f2. So Aronian thought that just by bringing his king up the board, just advancing slowly, he'd be able to push black backwards. But Carlsen finds this excellent move, rook e5. Okay, well, exchanging rooks is going to lead to a draw. So knight e6. If king h7, then, well, we've already seen something like this. This is winning for white. But king g6 is the move, and after check, the king comes up the board. And, well, there's a very nice trick here. Aronian played king f3, threatening rook h6, checkmate. Looks fatal, but in fact, after rook e3 check, they agreed a draw. Why did they agree a draw? Because after, if king takes, knight d5 check, takes the rook, and after king g6, white is unable to protect the pawn on f6, so black wins the last pawn. Now you see the point to playing c6. Basically, he just needed to exchange pawns off, all the pawns off on the queen side. If not, then white would still have a d pawn, and you could take here and with an easy win. So it was all to exchange pawns, and this pawn covers e5, so it's not possible for the king to cover the pawn on f6. A fantastic save from Carlsen. So there we go. I think it was really a fantastic struggle. Aronian showed his typical skill and creativity, but it was matched by Carlsen's toughness and ingenuity. So after 2 rounds, there are still 2 leaders in Wijk aan Zee, Karyarkin and Hari Krishna, who both have 1.5 points. If you enjoyed this my play of the day, then, and you haven't been on my YouTube channel before, it's free to subscribe, and I'll be doing reports on each round of Wijk aan Zee. Thanks very much for watching.